It is my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi and Dorothy Burge.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you, Dorothy, for agreeing to have this conversation today. Dorothy, I want to ask you how did you become involved in quilt making?
Well, when I was young, I came from a long line of quilters. And so you're looking at photos of quilters on my mother's side of the family. There are also quilters on my father's side of the family. But the lady in pink is my mom. Next to her, my grandmother. Then at the top, my great-grandmother, and then my great-great-grandmother. So they all quilted. And when I was in my teens, they tried to teach me to quilt. I had no interest in it at all. I felt it was for old people and that I would never do it. And then suddenly I got old, around 30, and I started quilting.
30's not old. That's still very, very young. But that's interesting. I love your work, and I like seeing how it's morphed from the time I first met you until this time today. So it's been an interesting journey, Dorothy. You've come a long way.
I really have, and I have to thank you for it. When we first met, it was at the DuSable Museum here in Chicago, and you were opening an exhibit called The Journey of Hope. And those were quilts about Barack Obama being the first African-American president in the country. And so I remember coming up to you and saying, Dr. Mazloomi, do you ever take quilts from people who are not members of the Women of Color Quilters Network? And you said, show me an example of your quilts. Well, I'm not really into tech, but I had a cell phone that I had just learned how to use, but not really. And so I tried to pull up a quilt that I had done, and it took me about a half an hour to get to the quilt. And you gave me your card and you said, send me the quilt and let me look at it. So being myself, I packed up all the quilts that I had done and sent them to you. And you called me and you critiqued each quilt. And that really changed my life in terms of wanting to be a quilter and how I thought about being a quilter. So I went back per your suggestion, took quilting classes, joined quilting guilds, and learned how to quilt so that it was not just about what was important to me, but also improving my skills as a quilter.
And lucky for us. Lucky for us. Dorothy, you taught college for 26 years. And I want to know, how did your teaching relate to your interest in human rights and social justice issues? How did that segue?
So I taught at a program where we brought students from 14 small liberal arts colleges to Chicago for a semester. They did internships. They took seminars on Chicago neighborhoods and urban issues. They did an independent study project, and they took a seminar, and I taught the seminar on human rights and social justice. And so whatever was happening in the city around human rights and social justice, I would try to figure out a way to put together an experiential session that would really engage that issue by talking to people who were either making policy or being directly impacted by the policy. And so here, what you're seeing is the quilt that I just talked about, that I asked you about. And that was
first quilt.
That's right. Trayvon Martin had been killed, and we were protesting in the city of Chicago. And so I created this quilt called Trayvon Could Be My Son. And that's because when I went to protest the first time, they asked us to wear a hoodie. And I wore a hoodie that belonged to my nephew. And while I was wearing the hoodie and marching, I could smell my nephew. And I was almost in tears thinking about how this could have been him. And so I came back and created this quilt using a photo of another great nephew, because we had a hoodies up day at our church. And so we took a picture of my great nephew with a hoodie holding iced tea and Skittles. And that only lasted for about 30 seconds before he tossed them to the side. So we were lucky to get this photo. And then I used it to create the quilt that I used to protest with. And so I was protesting with this quilt when I met you and you critiqued it.
And the quilt was later on placed in an exhibition, and Still We Rise, and it traveled the country for 6 years, and over 900,000 people had an opportunity to see not only that quilt, but the entire exhibition. So thank you for that, Dorothy. Can you tell me a little bit about your involvement, and concern about the death penalty and wrongful conviction? Because I know you're very active in both these topics. So can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, you're seeing a photo now of me with the students in my human rights and social justice seminar. And we're meeting with Mark Clemens, who was a survivor of police torture, served a number of decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. And so we met with Mark at the legal clinic at Northwestern University, and also met with one of his attorneys, Flint Taylor, from the People's Law Office. So I got involved on the issue of police misconduct, the death penalty, wrongful convictions in the early 90s, because I met some incredible activists, and I started incorporating the people that I met in their stories into my teaching.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so if we look at the next slide, this is a slide of a young man by the name of Eric Blackman. And Eric Blackman served almost 16 years for a crime he didn't commit. And so meeting people like him really fuels me to keep doing the kind of activism that I do. He wrote this incredible poem, and if it's okay, I'm going to read just part of it. He says, 15 years, 7 months, 4 weeks, 1 day, 16 hours and 33 minutes to be exact, 5,724 dreadful days, 137,416 and a half hours, 8,244,993 miserable minutes. And I won't forget a second of it. I missed 66 of my kids' birthdays, 337 holidays, 16 vacations, 14 graduations, 11 funerals, first steps, first words, all of my 20s, half of my 30s, most of my life. I lost everything, every dime I had, 4 appeals, friends, family, my fiance, my relationship with my kids. At times I lost my faith, other times I lost hope, a few times I even lost myself, but I survived. I survived the conditions, the honorary officers, some wolfish, vulturous inmates, a stabbing, being jumped, 2 black eyes, 2 busted lips, 1 chipped tooth, a busted head, 6 stitches, 1 broken nose, 1 fractured arm, 1 concussion, the suffering, the pain, the loss, but I overcame. I endured by never hearing, never seeing, never speaking, never caring, never feeling, never loving, never resting, never giving up. For 15 years, 7 months, 4 weeks, 1 day, 16 hours, and 33 minutes, all for a crime I did not commit. And I cannot forget a second of it, but who's counting? So after meeting people like this, having these people in my lives who have been through so much and who come out with such an incredible positive spirit and do the work to reform and really push for the end to systemic racism, which is the cause of many of them being locked up.
And needless to say, I know that you're not in agreement with the death penalty. And
I am
this
not.
speaks to why you feel that it should be abolished.
Yes, I really do think that the death penalty should be abolished. Over the years, I've met with many people. These are two more people who were on death row for crimes they did not commit. Mark Clemens, who is now working with the Chicago Torture Justice Center. These are people who were tortured by John Burge, police commander here in Chicago, and David Bates. Both did decades for crimes they did not commit and were on death row. In the early 90s, I started working with a group called the Campaign to End the Death Penalty, and also a group called the Committee to Free Mumia and Aaron Patterson. And at that time in Chicago, there were 10 people on death row, and we were working hard to get them off of death row.
Well, that leads into my next question about some of those individuals that you have personally fought for when it comes to life in prison issues. And I'm thinking in particularly about Ronald Hudson, because there's a quilt in the Textile Center that deals with his plight. Can you tell me about him, and especially that end story as it refers to the quilt that you made?
Yes, absolutely. Well, this quilt that you're seeing is an attorney by the name of Joey Mogul and two other survivors of police torture. And now this quilt is a quilt of Ronald Hudson. Also, this is the photo of Ronald Hudson being released from prison after spending 37 years in prison. Now, the interesting thing about Ronald Hudson, that he helped to change my perspective in a number of different ways. I was always fighting for people who were on death row, who were innocent and who had been wrongfully convicted, until I heard about the case of Ronald Hudson. So Ronald Hudson was on death row, and he, at the age of 19, killed a man and robbed him. And he was sentenced to the death penalty because of a lot of activism by a number of different groups around Illinois. That sentence was commuted to life without possibility of parole. But I wanted to talk about the fact that while Ronaldo was in prison, he could not read or write. And so he taught himself to read and to write. He went back to school and got a degree. He is now a minister. He became a model prisoner for over 20 years. No problems at all. He became a mentor to people who were coming into the prison. He also helped to create programs for people who were coming into the prison. And I really want to talk about the fact that here is a person who grew up in poverty, whose mother and father had addiction issues. And because of that, he was moved from household to household. And so he never got the kind of support he was supposed to get as a child. And at the age of 7, his brother fell down, his twin brother fell down a flight of stairs and was killed. Later on, when he was about 15, his older brother came into the house and shot up the family members, including him. 2 people died. And because of all of this trauma that he never received any services for, it led him to an addiction issue. And so hearing about him, I felt like I really needed to do something to raise awareness about the fact that we have people who are on death row or who have been sentenced to life without possibility of parole, who should at least be given the opportunity to be released because they have changed their lives and become different people. And so the person who is holding the sign is a woman by the name of Alice Kim, who is an incredible activist in the city of Chicago. I've known her since she just came out of college about 25 years ago. So she's been active against the death penalty. She now teaches at the University of Chicago, and she runs a center for human rights and social justice. So Ronaldo is released about 2 months ago. He is out. He is doing well. I am honored to know him.
So you did meet him after?
Yes, I actually got the
released.
opportunity to meet him, and it was very interesting because when Ronaldo called, I was taking my silver sneakers class, you know, for senior citizens. And so there I was getting ready to go into my exercise class, and I got this call that just really like uplifted me. And I don't think I've ever worked out so well since getting that call.
That's wonderful. Can you tell me about your involvement in Chicago with the organization Blacks Against Police Torture?
Yes, and that's how I got involved in a lot of these issues around the death penalty and around wrongful conviction. And I'm doing a series of quilts about fighting for reparations in Illinois, because Chicago is the first and only city in this country that has granted reparations to African Americans. And the idea came from the man that you see there who has his hand up, who's attorney Standish Willis, incredible activist, an incredible attorney, started his career with the People's Law Office, has worked to get many people off of death row, many people released who have been wrongfully convicted, and has fought and constantly had a presence in the African American community, continuing to raise awareness about the issues and all of the people who are being impacted in the African American community by the systemic racism in the criminal justice system. The person who you see in the red and in the hat and the glasses is an incredible woman by the name of Patricia Hill. Patricia Hill was part of the African American Police League. She headed it, and she passed away a couple of years ago. And I really feel like she has not been honored in the way that she should be honored. She fought against corrupt policing while she was on the police force, and that led to her being fired at least 5 times, and because of the activism, being put back to work, and her continued struggle fighting against police misconduct while she was on the police force, being very active after she retired from the police force, and she ended her career as a professor at Northeastern Illinois University.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you participate in or make work that's being shown in these exhibits in museums and galleries around the United States, how do you want the viewer to view your work? What are the takeaways from viewing your work? What do you want the takeaway to be?
I want people to realize that we, especially as people of color, are still fighting for freedom in this country. And so the photo that you're looking at is the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Committee. Young people came with incredible ideas about how we could get reparations for survivors of the police torture that happened in Chicago. And one of the things they did was a die-in. And so We all went to City Hall and we laid on the floor, and it was just an incredible experience. I did tell them though that I was old and I was gonna lay on the floor, but they were gonna have to help me get up. And they, and
Dorothy, we can't hear you.
fighting. We're still fighting even after the ordinance was passed to get the things that they promised us that they would give us. And so I want people, when they see my work, to think about what are the issues that we're dealing with in this country, especially people of color, as they relate to the criminal justice system, systemic racism. I want them to have conversations about it. I want them to then do some action. I want to move them to action by seeing the work. And so that is really my goal.
I always say that I do believe quilts are a good vehicle in which to tell stories and take up causes, because everybody's familiar with quilts here. We're familiar with fabric. From cradle to the grave, we have a relationship with fabric. So for me, my idea, it's an easy way to tell a story and get a point across by using an art form that's so familiar to so many people. When we talk about, or when you speak about the men that have been wrongfully incarcerated, and I mentioned this to you the other day, I find it absolutely incredible. I see these men, some of them have been in prison for over 40 years, 47 years, 48 years, and they come out, and the one commonality that they all have, they have no malice or hatred in their heart. And that is, I find, mind-boggling, to be locked up under false pretenses for so long and get out after missing your entire life, and you're not filled with anger and hatred. It's amazing. These men are amazing. I always define myself as a woman born in the Jim Crow segregated South, and I have seen myself growing up men that have these horribly long prison sentences for little or nothing. I was reading this in article in about the civil liberties, American Civil Liberties Union, and there were some stats in there about people that have gotten life sentences in the South for incredible stuff, like stealing 3 belts from a department store, or 2 bottles of liquor, or stealing a television set from a vacant, an abandoned house, and you get a life sentence for that. So when you think in terms of people saying that all lives matter, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter, white lives have always mattered in this country. The stuff that happens to us would never happen to anybody else. And this is why this movement is important, to bring attention to Black lives, because we still endure a lot that we shouldn't. So I'm so happy to be able, Dorothy, to curate your work and put that work out there before the public, because this is what I love to do, to talk about social justice issues. And like you, hopefully seeing this work will not only educate people about our plight, but cause a change in an attitude, how people feel and think about issues that surround the national African American community. So I applaud you for that, and I thank you for that. I want to ask if at this time there are questions for Dorothy that anyone has. We can take a few questions. Okay, Dorothy, can you see these questions on the screen? Someone's asking, where is your work now? Oh, it disappeared there.
Oh, so there's no questions that have come right up yet, but
Okay.
Please post them in the Q&A and we'd be happy to ask. But
okay, but I saw someone that mentioned, well, they were asking, where, Dorothy, is your work? Where can your works be seen? Where have they been shown?
Well, they have traveled with a number of the Women of Color Quilter Network's exhibitions. And so they've been part of In Still We Rise and human rights exhibits. And they are in several of the books that have been created by you, Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi. And I just really believe that being part of the Women of Color Quilters Network helped me to get these quilts out of the trunk in my basement and out into the public. And I'm very, very thankful for that. As you're looking at this last set of this last slide, this is of Laquan McDonald, a young man who was shot by police within 2 minutes of being arriving on the scene. He's a man who had some mental health issues. And so I also hope that the quilts will get us to think about policing in a different way, that when you call for help, you don't need to send the police. You can send a mental health worker. There's things that we can do without police in our communities. And so hopefully that's also something that I want to emphasize, that there's so many issues that we are still struggling with. The woman that you see who is sitting down is the mother of Gerald Reed, a Burge torture survivor who is still in prison. So we're still fighting to get Gerald Reed out of prison for a crime he did not commit.
I have to say, I just saw a note come across the screen from Ronald Hudson. He says, your son, Ronald Hudson, he's watching. That must be such a wonderful feeling, Dorothy, to help someone. It just has to be a great feeling both ways, from you as helper to Ronaldo in receiving that help. So it's just wonderful, absolutely fantastic. Someone wanted to know as well, what kind of materials do you use in your quilts, and what is your creative process to create the work?
My creative process is that I have a huge family. So I have 6 brothers and sisters, and they have children and grandchildren, and some of them have great-grandchildren. And so if there is an issue that I feel really moved by, I will go to one of these nieces and nephews and I will say, do you want to be a quilt? And sometimes they will run and sometimes they will say yes. The quilt that you're looking at of Laquan, that is one of my great nephews, and he agreed to be the quilt. But then when the exhibition happened in Chicago, he came and said very loudly at age 4 years old, I don't wear my hair like that anymore. you need to do another quilt. So I am inspired by the young people. They will, the young people in my family, the 20-something, the 30-year-olds, they will call and say, are you gonna do a quilt about this issue? This is something that's really happening that, you know, we need to have awareness raised about. And so I am always moved by what is happening in the country. And I have all of these relatives because to me, when I can show the impact that an issue has on me as an African-American woman and mother, to me, that makes the quilt more powerful. And so I use the photos that I have of them, and then I use the photos to create the patterns, and I change what they're wearing. I change so that you can get the message that I'm trying to send. So here I added Laquan, I added 16 because he was shot 16 times. And so I'm using the information and the photo to create a quilt.
I have a question here. Someone wanted to know the name of the woman in AAPL who has since passed away. You
Patricia
mentioned
Hill. Patricia Hill. We refer to her as Pat Hill, the African American Police League in Chicago. Incredible activist. She and Stan Willis are some of the main reasons that we didn't have the Olympics here in Chicago, because we protested the Olympics coming to Chicago when we didn't have freedom in Chicago. So Pat Hill reached out to John Carlos because she had also been an Olympic athlete, and he came and protested against the Olympics coming to Chicago until they did something about the issue of police torture.
someone asked, in looking at the photograph, that the students in the group photograph that was taken are primarily white. And they want to know, how do you guide them to action?
Well, I think what happens is, because we are an experiential program, and I thought that what would be really effective is to let them hear from the folks who had been directly impacted. I also would give them assignments where they had to interview people who had been directly impacted by policy. And youth do a lot of social media activism. And so I would try to stay connected to that activism and give those things that were happening on social media as assignments. And so one assignment was, after Trayvon Martin was killed, there were lots of images of Trayvon showing him in a very negative light. And so young people created this hashtag, which photo would you use? And I gave that as an assignment. So which photo would they use of you?
Okay, Dorothy's camera's frozen there, so we didn't hear the last part of what you said.
Okay, I would have them do assignments like, which photo would you use? Because that was a hashtag. And I would say, you are people who come from privilege. So which photo would they use of you?
Uh-oh, we've lost Dorothy again, but I think most people hearing get the gist of what you're saying in the use of the photograph. So someone wanted to know, where's your work leading you currently?
Right now, what I want to do is, I would like to document the fight for reparations in the city of Chicago by looking at some of the people who are survivors, some of the people who got out, some of the people who are still incarcerated that we're fighting to get out, the activists who were involved, because it was a very multiracial, intergenerational group of people who fought for reparations, and to use a lot of the information that we have documented that we are providing to the Chicago Public Schools to create a series of quilts about reparations. I also had a incredible life-changing experience by going to the Freedom Trail in Alabama. And I really would like to document Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery events in a series of quilts.
That should be interesting. Someone's asking, are there comparable reparations organizations happening in Minneapolis? We don't live in Minneapolis, Dorothy and I, but perhaps Carl might know the answer to that.
I do not know the answer to that, and I think that's a very good question, and we should explore that and find out. And Dorothy, when the time is right, we should have you here in Minneapolis also speaking in person once the pandemic has passed. And I think one question that came up, Dorothy, that I think is very profound as we think about in Minneapolis about our own policing, which has been, rather controversial all summer long and into the fall and winter now, is what ways has policing changed in Chicago through these efforts that you have undertaken? Have you seen impact through your work that you are pleased about or that you have hope about?
What I have hope about is the fact that young people are active. And so we have a lot of young activists in the city of Chicago who are holding the police accountable. I am encouraged by the movement to defund parts of the police and to move that funding into other areas, especially for mental health. I am not a strong believer in all of this mandated racial bias, implicit bias training, because I do not believe that it is going to be successful. I believe that if a person sees me and sees me very differently, then they are sitting in a training for a couple of weeks isn't going to change that. And so in Chicago, we have a group called Bridging the Divide, where we work with Chicago police officers who want to establish a better relationship with people in the community. And so they are trained in restorative justice practices, and they are out in the community meeting with different community leaders and activists. But this is a volunteer program, but I think it is something that gives me a great deal of hope.
Beautiful. Someone's asking, are there times they're touched by your work and how beautiful it is and how you describe the emotional and artistic process. How do you connect with that process personally?
When something really weighs heavily on my mind, the way that I deal with it is I create a quilt. Trayvon was on my mind forever, and I had to figure out a way to move. And so I created that quilt. Laquan being shot 16 times was something that weighed on me. And so I had to create a quilt to really get the feelings out of me, to help me to be able to move on in a positive direction to work for change. And so the quilting helps me do that.
We have a question here, or maybe a comment. I'm curious if you remember any of the most important suggestions that I've given you.
Oh, yes, I remember them. Yes, I do remember them.
Maybe you don't want to go into that.
Oh, yes.
Anyway.
Yes, I just have to say
suggestions that I gave you to help you to work on your quilts.
Yes, and I have to say that is the reason why I joined a number of different quilt organizations here in the city of Chicago, quilting guilds, took quilting classes, because I had ideas about the quilts, but I was not making quality quilts. And so you critiquing each one of those quilts over the phone, even telling me which materials to use, which materials not to use, the fact that the back had to look as good as the front. Who would have ever thought that? Duh. So it was those kind of critiques that really helped me become a better quilter.
Someone wants to know if any of your students, the students that you taught in college, have become quilters or artists in any fashion.
Some of them have become artists. I am very, very proud of the students that I taught here in Chicago. One is running the Cabrini Green Legal Aid Services now, who works for people who cannot afford legal services. One is running MICFA Challenge, a program that teaches young high school students to become activists. And so they are doing art, they are doing social justice work. I am in contact with a number of them still to this day, many of them from 20 years ago. And I am really honored that I have stayed in their lives.
Wonderful. Someone asked, during your social justice advocacy work regarding the police, have you ever engaged in conversations with the police unions, and how has that helped the community in their positive police reforms?
I have engaged with a number of police officers in a positive way, mostly African-American police officers, not with the police union. And so I have conducted trainings for a group called Positive Anti-Crime Thrust, which is a group that was founded by one of the former directors of the African-American Police League, Howard Sappho. And I just have to tell this funny story. When they came to get me to facilitate the retreat, my students were there and some of them were in uniform, and my students stepped in and said, "Who are you here for?" And they said, "We came to get Dorothy Burge." "For what?" "Miss Dorothy, does your family know about this? Do you have a number where we can reach you?" So during the retreat that I facilitated for the Black officers from around the country, whenever they stepped out of line, somebody would say, "You better get back in line. You know those students will get you. They waiting for you." So yes, my students were very protective, and I appreciate that.
Someone wants to know, is there any other medium of art that you are involved in?
I have recently begun to do embroidery and to do working on trying to create images with embroidery techniques. And I find that to be very interesting, but I don't think it's going to replace my quilting desires. Let me put it that way.
There's someone in the audience mentioned, well, states that in essence, a lot of the work that you do is dealing with topics that are not so pleasant. I've had the same question in Minneapolis before. And do you ever do work that is happy and joyful?
I started quilting by doing happy and joyful work because I could not afford the kind of artwork that I wanted in my home. So that's how I started to quilt. So I started quilting because I wanted to have these art pieces that I could frame and hang, and I still have those around my house. However, I have to say that I have not done a lot of those lately. I have done quilts to honor ancestors, and I find that to be very rewarding, that people have come to me and said, can you do a quilt?
We can't hear you.
I really feel that my calling is to do the social justice quilting.
You know, to that person that asked if you ever do any happy work, I have to answer me personally. You know, I do works about my family, but most of the work that I do, it centers around my conditions, my living life here as a Black woman in America. Okay, when that life is totally joyful, then I'm sure I'll create something else. Right now, it's not a joyful life. Okay, so the inspiration comes from what is around me. So if it's pleasant and happy, I'm sure um, my work would change. But I have to do work that evolves from what's around me. And right now, life is not very pleasant for people, Black folks living in this country. So where's the joy?
And I also think for me, it's important because I'm doing these quilts to pass on to the next generation. So it's important for me to document what is happening to us from the perspective of an African-American mother and woman who's living in this country, who's having to deal with a lot of these issues, because I want them to have the history from my perspective as I pass it down in the same way that it was passed orally to me when I was a child.
And that's important. That's important. I look at quilters as griots. We're telling the story of what's happening in our community, okay? So that kind of ticks me off when somebody asks me, well, why don't you do joyful quilts? And I say, to each his own. And don't tread on me. Let me tell my story and the story of my people and what's actually happening. And you're right. This is what we have to pass on to the next generation. What was happening in our communities, in our country, in our neighborhoods, and with our families at this point in time in our lives. We give an actual depiction of that, coming from a Black perspective, nobody else's perspective, but our perspective, which we know is the truth. It's not sugar-coated, and it's not coming from somebody else outside of the culture. It's coming from us. So there you have it.
Dorothy, there's a question that came in about, could you talk about your perspective on cultural appropriation in art? What is the line between empathy for others and telling someone else's story?
I think it's very interesting when you try to tell someone else's story and you have not even made contact with the people whose story you're telling. And to me, that is cultural appropriation, that you can see something that you can make money on. You know, I will just use the example of George Floyd. If you were to walk outside in Chicago right now, you would be able to find t-shirts all over the city about George Floyd for people who have no interest in seeking justice for George Floyd, but who just want to raise money. And so I find that not to be acceptable. I find that we all have our own histories, And I believe that we can tell history from our perspective. And I do not have an issue with someone who is not African American doing a quilt about something that happened in the African American community, but they need to acknowledge the fact that they're not African American and they're doing it from their own perspective, that they're not doing it from the perspective of someone who has lived through the issues that we are talking about. They're doing it from the perspective of someone who has read a book or done some other things, but not actually been involved, worked for justice on a lot of these issues. And I find that to be cultural appropriation when you come in to use an art form to make money and to use somebody else's story to make money or to get attention or to get fame.
And I just want to add something that's just a little segue here when we talk about telling a story about a culture, about a race. A good example of that is early quilt history. Early quilt history for African American quilts, we did not have participation by African American scholars in early quilt history. And white scholars wrote from the perspective of what they assumed we meant and what they assumed the symbols in our work meant. And everything was an assumption. They never, ever asked African American quilters why they made things the way they made, okay? It was only until Questa Benberry, Roland Freeman, Gladys Fry came on the scene that, you know, papers were written and books were written from our perspective with our input. So you can't write about a people and you don't know them and you don't ask them. Everything else is BS.
And that's why when I taught my seminar, I always said, you've got to go and interview somebody. If this is an issue that's important to you, you need to go interview the person who's been impacted by the policy that you want to write about or to do research on. You can't just say, oh, I read this, and so this is what.
We've lost the last bit of what you were saying, but our time has come to an end. I want to thank Carl and the Textile Center and our sponsors for this conversation with Dorothy. And Dorothy, thank you. Carl, thank you. And thanks to everyone that attended today. Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you to you, Carolyn, for curating a most exceptional set of exhibitions for us here in the Twin Cities. We're looking forward to this continuing on through June. And all of our current exhibitions are online in virtual form at textilecentermn.org. We have a guest book there, so if you would want to take a look at Dorothy's exhibition here in Minneapolis on our virtual exhibition site, please leave comments and we will share those with Dorothy. And again, thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.